The soft sound of the hose filled the morning air, mingling with the singing of birds nesting in the ancient trees of the vast garden of the mansion. The drops of water, falling onto the flowers, reflected the sunlight, creating small rainbows on the leaves. Samuel, the gardener of the estate, felt the freshness of the damp earth in his calloused hands. He dedicated himself to the work with an almost ritualistic fervor. The plants were his silent company, an escape from the pain he had carried since the death of his wife, Clara. 5 years ago, she was his sun, his reason to smile after an exhausting day. The memory of her laughter still echoed in his mind, a sound as soft as the wind through the leaves. But a car accident took her from his side, and since then, Samuel had buried himself in his work, trying to escape from a void that seemed impossible to fill. One morning, while pruning a rose, "Bush!" Samuel heard voices coming from the entrance of the mansion. He looked up to see the owner of the house, Mr. Ortega, an eccentric millionaire who rarely showed up, accompanied by a woman. Samuel froze at the sight of her, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman's figure was incredibly familiar. She had long brown hair, which the wind made dance gently, and her elegant posture contrasted with the expensive dresses she wore. But it was her eyes. That hit him like a punch. Deep brown eyes he never thought he would see again. He felt the air leave his lungs. That woman was identical to Clara, and yet it couldn't be her. Clara was dead. He himself had recognized the body. He was present at her burial, throwing a rose onto the grave. Mr. Ortega approached, introducing the woman as his wife, Helena. Helena smiled at Samuel with distant sympathy. Without showing any sign of recognition, he tried to disguise the trembling in his hands, forcing a smile as he greeted them. But discomfort took over his expression. When the couple entered the mansion, Samuel remained standing, staring at the closed door, trying to understand what he had just seen. He wondered if he was going crazy. It was impossible that Clara was alive, and even more impossible that she was the wife of such a powerful man. But that feeling, that tightness in his chest, it was Clara. He felt it in every fiber of his being. That night, doubt gnawed at him. He tossed and turned in the bed of the small cottage at the back of the property, trying to find answers to questions that seemed absurd. Could it be possible that Clara had somehow survived? Was she pretending to be someone else, trapped in a new life? But the most distressing question was another. If that woman really was Clara, why hadn't she recognized him? The following days were torture for Samuel every time Helena appeared in the mansion's gardens, accompanied by her husband or walking alone. He felt his chest tighten. She passed by him without showing a single sign of recognition. Her expression was always serene, her gestures graceful, as if she lived in a world distant from his. But Samuel began to notice small details that disturbed him even more. One day, while watching her from afar, he saw Helena bend down to pick a white rose, exactly as Clara used to do. She brought it to her face, closing her eyes for a brief moment, as if she was lost in the gentle aroma of the flower that awakened a memory so vivid in Samuel that he had to lean against a tree to keep from losing his balance. Determined to find answers, he began to ask discreet questions to the mansion's employees. He discovered that Helena had appeared in Mr. Ortega's life about 4 years ago, shortly after. Clara had died. There wasn't much information about her past. She had appeared like a sudden breeze, quickly winning the millionaire's affection. But the details about her origin were hazy. No one knew for sure where she came from, and she rarely spoke about her life before meeting Ortega. A sense of urgency grew in Samuel, a need to confront that woman who, whether she was Helena or Clara, was robbing him of his peace. He planned a meeting at dusk, when the gardens were empty and the sunlight tinged the leaves with a golden hue. Samuel waited for her near the wisteria arbor, a place that Clara had always loved. Helena appeared, walking slowly through the garden, her steps soft and careful. Samuel positioned himself in her path, feeling his heart race uncontrollably in his chest. When she saw him, she seemed surprised by his presence, but kept her composure. "Mrs. Helena," he began with a hesitant, almost hoarse voice. "I know this may sound strange, but there's something I need to ask, something that has been troubling me since I first saw you." She slightly furrowed her brow, an almost imperceptible gesture, but one that Samuel recognized. It was the same gesture that Clara made when she was confused or uncomfortable, that filled him with a desperate courage. "You remind me so much of someone I loved and lost." The words came out with difficulty, but Samuel forced himself to continue. "Someone I thought I had buried." Helena looked at him, her expression inscrutable. She remained silent for a few moments, as if pondering what to say, and then a slight smile formed on her lips, but there was a coldness in her eyes that made Samuel shudder. "Mr. Samuel, I don't know who this person you're talking about is," she replied, her voice sweet but with a tone that seemed to end the conversation. "Maybe it's just a coincidence, but I assure you there are no secrets to be uncovered." She turned, ready to continue her way, but Samuel couldn't hold back. He lightly grasped her arm, the touch light enough not to be an affront, but enough to make her stop. "Clara," he whispered, the word escaping his lips like a prayer. "Is it you?" For a moment that seemed eternal. She stood still, looking at Samuel's hand holding her arm. He noticed something change in her expression, a different glimmer in her eyes, a spark of emotion that she quickly tried to hide. But then, Helena released her arm with a firm movement and took a step back. Quickly composing herself, her face assumed an air of offended surprise. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Samuel." Her voice now had a cold, almost cutting tone. "I suggest you don't meddle in matters that don't concern you." And, without waiting for a response, she hurried away, leaving Samuel alone, his heart crushed by the mixture of hope and doubt that coiled in his mind. That night, while the mansion plunged into silence, Samuel sat at the edge of his bed, staring at an old photograph of Clara, lovingly kept in his wallet. The shadows cast by the candlelight flickered on the wooden walls of the cottage. He knew that Helena had reacted strangely. There was something in her gaze, something that couldn't be explained by mere coincidence. He decided he couldn't stop there. He needed to find out the truth, even if it meant digging into secrets that should have long been buried. The next morning, Samuel decided that he needed to go beyond Helena's evasive words. If she wasn't willing to tell the truth, he would try to discover it on his own. Over the following weeks, he watched Helena whenever possible, paying attention to any gesture or behavior that might provide a clue. Among the many flowers he tended, there was a special plant, a jasmine that Clara had always loved. One night, he saw Helena walking towards the bush, as if drawn by a distant memory. She stopped in front of it, ran her fingers over the white flowers, and inhaled their sweet fragrance. Samuel, hidden in the shadows, felt a wave of memories wash over him. That scene was identical to many he had lived with Clara, moments of simplicity that now seemed laden with hidden meanings. He watched her until she walked away, her gaze fixed on a distant point, as if she was lost in a world that no one else could reach. Samuel knew he needed to find out more about Helena's past, but his resources were limited, so he decided to take a risk and seek answers directly from someone who might know more. Mr. Ortega himself, with his heart racing, he waited until the millionaire was alone. In his study, a spacious room with glass windows that offered a panoramic view of the gardens, Samuel knocked softly on the door, and when called inside, he felt a shiver run down his spine. "Samuel, what brings you here?" asked Mr. Ortega, settling into his leather armchair with a glass of whiskey in hand. The man looked at him with the curiosity of someone not used to being interrupted by an employee. Samuel took a deep breath, the words heavy on his tongue. "Excuse my intrusion, sir, but I need to ask about your wife, Mrs. Helena." He felt Ortega's eyes narrow, but he continued before the man could react. "Do you know anything about her past, before you met?" The millionaire remained silent for a few seconds, observing Samuel as if trying to decipher his intentions. Finally, he leaned forward, placing the glass on the table with a soft thud. "Why this curiosity, Samuel?" His voice was calm, but it carried a tone of veiled threat. "Helena is my wife, and her past is nobody's business here, least of all a gardener's." Samuel felt the coldness in the response, but he didn't back down. He needed to push forward, even if it was risky. "I know it's not my place, sir, but she reminds me of someone. Someone I lost years ago. The resemblance is so strong that I wonder if there's something we don't know." He hesitated before continuing. "I know it. Sounds crazy, but if there's any detail you could tell me, it would mean a great deal to me." Mr. Ortega stared at him, his blue eyes cold and calculating. He seemed to assess Samuel as if he were a piece in a chess game before leaning back in his chair again. "Helena's story is tragic, Samuel. She doesn't like to talk about it, and I respect her wishes. I know she lost her memory in a serious accident, and the scars from that still haunt her. When I met her, she was lost, without anyone." He paused, his gaze drifting for a moment as if recalling something. "I helped her rebuild her life, and now she is my wife. That's all you need to know." Samuel felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. An accident. Memory loss. The pieces began to fit together in a frightening way in his mind. Could it be that Clara had survived the accident that he believed had taken her life? And that, with no memory of her past, she had become Helena, Ortega's wife? But if that were true, why hadn't Clara, if she really was Clara, recognized him immediately? What could have been erased from her mind? And above all, why did he feel that Mr. Ortega was hiding something? Samuel left the study with more questions than answers, his head spinning, but one thing was certain. He couldn't give up now. Clara could be closer to him than he had ever imagined, and he had to do whatever it took to uncover the truth that night. As the wind howled through the trees and the full moon illuminated the mansion's gardens, Samuel made a decision. He needed to find a way to speak to Helena alone, without the barriers of secrecy that Ortega had built around her. The night descended on the mansion like a veil, and silence took over the luxurious hallways, interrupted only by the rustling of leaves in the wind in the gardens. Samuel waited. Patiently among the shadows, near the wisteria arbor, he knew that Helena often went out for solitary walks at night, enjoying the quiet. It was his only chance to talk to her without Ortega's watchful presence or the employee's eyes. Finally, he saw her appear, wrapped in a light shawl that danced with the night breeze. She walked slowly, as if trying to escape something, chasing her in her own thoughts. Samuel stepped forward, emerging from the shadows, and she stopped abruptly when she saw him. "What are you doing here, Samuel?" she asked, surprised and slightly suspicious. Her voice, always controlled, seemed more vulnerable in the darkness. He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. Her presence so close made his chest ache, but he couldn't back down now. "Helena, I need you to listen to me, just for a few minutes." His voice came out rougher than he expected, filled with contained emotion. "I know all of this sounds insane, but I need you to hear me, to consider the possibility that you might be someone you don't remember being." She took a step back, her eyes narrowing as if trying to read Samuel's intentions. He saw a flicker of fear in her expression, something she tried to hide, but for a moment she didn't interrupt him, so he continued. "You look so much like Clara, my wife." The words came out with a weight he had carried for weeks. "She died in an accident, or at least that's what I thought, but since I saw you, everything about you tells me that maybe she somehow survived, lost her memories. Mr. Ortega mentioned an accident, memory loss." Helena opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated. There was an internal struggle reflected on her face. She placed a hand over her chest as if trying to calm a racing heart. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper, almost a plea for help. "I don't know why you're saying this. I don't remember anything before meeting my husband. He found me lost without memories of my past." her eyes filled with something close to despair. But sometimes at night dreams that feel real, as if I were living another life. I see a man, I see a house, I see a smile, but I can't remember the details. She rubbed her forehead hard, as if trying to pull the memories from within her mind. Samuel took a step forward, hope growing in his chest. Those dreams, Helena. Do you think they could be memories? He asked, his voice almost breaking. Do you remember anything specific? Any place? Any name? Helena looked at him, her eyes shining with tears. She struggled to hold back. She seemed about to say something, but then a sound cut through the night, a door slamming, and Samuel and Helena turned simultaneously, seeing the imposing figure of Mr. Ortega emerging on the mansion's porch, his face obscured by shadow, but his posture tense and watchful. What's going on here? His voice was sharp, and Samuel saw the fear spread across Helena's face. She stepped back, taking a step as if she were a child caught in a mischief. I was just walking, dear. Samuel was helping me pick some flowers for tomorrow, Helena said, trying to force a smile, but her voice trembled slightly. Samuel felt a wave of frustration and despair. He had been so close to getting an answer, to reaching the truth, and now Ortega was there, guarding the secret that surrounded Helena like a cloak. He knew he couldn't directly challenge Ortega, not in that situation, so he just bowed his head, pretending submission. Forgive me, sir. I was just doing my duty, he said, keeping his voice controlled. I didn't mean to trouble you. Mr. Ortega cast a hard look at Samuel before extending his hand to Helena. Come, dear, it's late. His voice was soft, but there was something dangerous in his tone. Helena hesitated for a moment, looking at Samuel as if she wanted to say something more. But finally, she took her husband's hand and allowed herself to be led back into the mansion. Samuel stayed there, alone under the pale moonlight, feeling helpless. But he knew one thing. Helena wasn't indifferent to those distant memories he had stirred. There was something in her, something that reacted to the mention of Clara, like a flame fighting not to be extinguished. With his gaze fixed on the mansion's silhouette, Samuel promised himself that he wouldn't let this be the end. He needed to know what Mr. Ortega was hiding, and if there truly was a chance that Clara was still there, he would fight to the end to bring her back, even if it meant facing Ortega's power and the buried secrets of that house. In the days that followed, Samuel felt the tension increase in the mansion. Ortega's presence had become more constant, as if he was worried about keeping Helena always under surveillance. She no longer strolled alone through the gardens, and the glances she cast at Samuel were quick, furtive, filled with a fear she tried to hide. Sensing that he needed a new plan, Samuel decided to explore a risky possibility. Investigating Ortega's documents, he knew that the millionaire kept a locked office in a more secluded wing of the mansion, a place where only he and Helena had access. But a chance conversation with one of the employees revealed that Ortega usually kept a spare key to the office in the tool shed, where Samuel spent much of his time. One quiet afternoon, when the mansion was silent, Samuel found the key hidden among some ceramic pots. His heart beat fast, and he felt a chill as he realized the risk he was taking. But if there was any document, any clue that could explain Helena's past, he needed to find it. As night fell, when the lights of the mansion began to go out, Samuel slipped through the hallways toward the office. He used the key to unlock the heavy wooden door and entered a room filled with the scent of leather and polished wood. The shelves were lined with leather-bound books and meticulously organized folders. On the mahogany desk, a framed photograph of Ortega and Helena's wedding rested in a silver frame. Samuel began to rummage through the drawers, trying to make as little noise as possible. He found contracts, business documents, and old letters. But it was in a black leather folder, hidden at the back of one of the locked drawers, that he found something that made his heart stop. The folder contained Helena's medical records, dated around 4 years ago at the time when Ortega claimed to have found her. The papers mentioned physical trauma consistent with a car accident, and, more importantly, spoke of dissociative amnesia, a memory loss caused by severe trauma, but there was more. Attached to the medical records was a police report detailing an accident that had occurred on the same date and location where Clara had died. The descriptions matched the accident that had taken his wife's life, but what left him breathless was a final note made by the investigating officer. "One body was reported missing after the initial rescue." Samuel staggered, feeling his legs tremble. He gripped the edge of the desk, trying to process the information. If Clara had somehow survived the accident he believed had killed her, and had been found without memories, Ortega could have taken her in without revealing her true identity. But why? What would he gain from keeping this secret? Was it love, or something darker, a desire to control someone who had lost everything? Before he could process the implications, he heard footsteps outside. He quickly put the papers back in the folder and locked the drawer, feeling sweat trickle down his temples. Without time to leave, he hid behind a heavy curtain near the window, hoping not to be discovered. The door opened and he recognized Helena's voice. "I don't know how much longer I can stand this, Diego," she said, her voice trembling, almost desperate. Samuel squinted, trying to see better through the small gap in the curtain. She stood in front of the desk while Ortega remained by the door, arms crossed. "You have everything you need here, Helena," Ortega replied, his tone firm. "A husband who loves you, a comfortable life. Why do you want to remember a past that would only bring pain?" "Because I feel like something was taken from me, something I can't reach." Helena's voice rose, filled with a pain that Samuel immediately recognized. "Sometimes I feel like I know this place, but that I should be somewhere else, with someone." She stopped, her voice choked with tears. Ortega approached her, holding her face between his hands, but his look seemed more threatening than affectionate. "Helena, you are mine now. The past no longer exists. Only what I have given you exists, and it's best you accept that." Samuel clenched his fists, feeling anger boil in his blood. He knew Ortega was manipulating Helena, but he couldn't reveal himself there, not without a plan. So he waited in silence, watching as Helena, still confused and shaken, left the office, closely followed by Ortega. When their footsteps finally disappeared down the hallway, Samuel left his hiding place and climbed out the window to avoid being seen. The truth he had uncovered burned in his mind, but it also brought a new sense of purpose. He knew he needed to rescue Helena from that life of lies. He needed to show her who she truly was before Ortega destroyed her completely. He looked at the mansion one last time that night, its imposing silhouette outlined against the starry sky, and made a silent promise. He would bring Clara back, no matter the cost, after that night. Samuel knew he could no longer delay. He needed to help Helena remember her past before Ortega buried it forever under the new identity he had imposed. The knowledge that Clara could still be there, somewhere deep within Helena, fueled a fierce determination in his chest. But the path ahead was dangerous, and a single misstep could mean his own ruin. Samuel spent the following days planning in silence, watching Ortega's and Helena's every move. Looking for an opening, he noticed that Ortega frequently left for business meetings at night, leaving Helena alone in the mansion for a few hours. It was the only time she wasn't under constant surveillance, determined to act. Samuel waited for one of those nights. When the moment finally arrived, Samuel left a simple, discreet message in the greenhouse, where he knew Helena would visit. The message was an invitation to meet by the lake, in the heart of the estate, a place hidden from the prying eyes of the staff and the shadow of Ortega. At midnight, he waited by the lake's edge, where the water's surface reflected the stars like a dark mirror. The cold wind brushed against his skin, bringing with it a sense of anticipation and fear. He wondered if Helena would come, if she was ready to confront the truths he had uncovered. When Helena finally appeared among the trees, wrapped in a coat that seemed to swallow her delicate figure, Samuel felt a pang of hope. She approached slowly, her eyes confused, but there was a resolution in her expression that he hadn't seen before. "Did you want to speak with me, Samuel?" Her voice sounded shaky, but there was also something defiant in her tone, as if she were tired of being controlled. He nodded, moving closer to her carefully, as if he feared that any word might shatter the fragile bond that united them in that moment. He pulled the papers from the folder he had taken from Ortega's office and handed them to her. Helena took them with trembling hands, reading quickly, her eyes widening as she understood what was before her. "This," she began, her voice faltering. "This can't be true. I don't remember any of this. I don't remember ever being someone other than Helena Ortega." Samuel took her hands in his, the papers falling to the ground. Forgotten, he felt. The urgency in his words, as if every second was too precious to waste. "I know it's difficult, Helena, but something inside you knows that there's a truth beyond what Ortega told you." He searched her eyes, trying to reach the person he knew. "He found you after the accident, but he hid your former life. He hid what you lost, perhaps because he feared that if you remembered, you would leave. He made you believe there was nothing beyond what he built for you." Helena pulled her hands away, stepping back as if Samuel's words were a burn on her skin. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to shield from an invisible storm. "I don't know if I can believe you, Samuel. I don't know who to believe." Her voice was a whisper, filled with pain and doubt. "But I want to know. I want to understand. And if what you say is true, then I need to see for myself." Samuel saw in that moment the determination appear in her eyes, like a fragile flame that finally found fuel. He knew she was ready to fight, but he also knew they needed to act quickly. Ortega wouldn't take long to realize that something was wrong. "If you want to know the truth, then you need to come with me now." He extended his hand to her, his heart racing. "Let's leave here. Let's find a safe place. I'll tell you everything, and you can decide for yourself what to do." Helena looked at Samuel's outstretched hand and hesitated for a moment. But then, as if something finally broke inside her, she took it. Her touch was cold and trembling, but there was a firmness there that Samuel hadn't felt in years. "Let's go," she said, her voice a bit stronger. "Let's find the truth together." With his heart pounding, Samuel guided her through the shadows of the trees, away from the mansion's watchful eyes. They knew they needed to escape. That's the estate. Find a place where they could plan their next step, far from Ortega's reach. But as they vanished into the darkness, Samuel knew that the true confrontation was yet to come. That moment of escape was only the beginning of a dangerous journey where every step could mean the difference between freedom and a return to a nightmare. And he also knew that if Clara was still alive inside Helena, it would take more than words to awaken her. Completely. The two walked in silence, Samuel guiding Helena along a hidden path among the trees, away from the security cameras that monitored the estate's boundaries. The night air was cold, but each step they took brought the promise of answers, of a chance for Helena to regain her true identity. They reached an old tool shed located at the back of the property, near the edge of the grounds. Samuel knew there was a car there. Old, but functional, something he had kept as a precaution, a sort of escape valve in case they needed to leave quickly. He unlocked the door and turned on a small lamp, casting a dim light over the dusty shelves and rusted tools. "Stay here for a moment. I need to get the car ready," Samuel said, as he turned on the light and began checking the engine. Helena sat on a wooden bench, still holding her arms around herself, her eyes lost in the void. She tried to process everything that was happening, as if she was about to wake up from a nightmare. But then, a distant sound echoed through the night, the sound of a car approaching quickly down the road leading to the mansion. Samuel stopped what he was doing, his eyes widening with concern. "It can't be! Ortega came back sooner than expected!" Panic edged his voice, and he hurried, trying to start the car. The engine coughed once, twice, and Samuel cursed under his breath, trying not to lose his calm. Helena stood up, her eyes wide, seeing the tension on Samuel's face. "He's going to find us here, isn't he?" she asked, her voice trembling with growing fear. But there was something else in it too, a hint of determination. "And if he finds me, he won't let me discover anything about my past." Samuel clenched his teeth, forcing the engine again. Finally, the car roared to life, but they heard the sound of car doors slamming outside. Ortega was closer than Samuel had anticipated. "Quick, get in the car!" he ordered as he opened the door for Helena. She obeyed, and he sped off, driving down the dirt road that led away from the mansion. But before they could disappear into the night, a figure appeared in front of the car, illuminated by the headlights. Ortega. He stood there, his face twisted with rage and something else, a shadow of desperation that made Samuel hesitate. Helena covered her mouth with her hands, stifling a scream as she saw him standing there like a ghost emerging from her worst nightmares. Samuel slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the gravel road. Ortega advanced to the window, pounding on the glass with his clenched fist. "Get out of the car now, Samuel, and bring my wife with you." Ortega's voice was filled with a fury that made the air around them freeze. Samuel looked at Helena, searching for any sign of hesitation, any desire to go back. But she was rigid, her eyes fixed on Ortega with a mix of fear and something deeper. A growing determination, as if she finally understood what she had to do. "No, Diego, I will not go back to you," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "Enough with the lies, enough with the secrets." Ortega hesitated for a moment, as if her words had struck him like a blow. But then his face twisted into a cold, bitter smile. "You have no idea what you're giving up, Helena. You have no idea what you'll lose." Before he could say anything else, Samuel shifted gears and accelerated. The car lurched forward, swerving around Ortega, who had to jump out of the way. The night closed in around them as the mansion's lights disappeared in the rearview mirror, and Samuel felt a wave of relief mixed with fear of what lay ahead. But he knew this wasn't a victory, just the start of a new battle. They were out of the mansion, but Ortega's eyes still followed them, and Samuel was sure the man wouldn't let them escape so easily. There would be retaliation, and they needed to be prepared. Helena, beside him, remained silent but squeezed Samuel's hand for a moment as he drove, gripping his fingers tightly, as if seeking courage in the warmth of his touch. He glanced at her quickly and saw tears in her eyes, but this time there was something else, a spark of hope he hadn't seen in years. "Thank you for not giving up on me, Samuel," she whispered, her voice fragile but full of genuine emotion that made him squeeze her hand in return. "I could never give up, Clara." He used the name he knew so well, risking a look in her direction. "I never gave up on you." She swallowed hard, turning her gaze back to the road that stretched ahead of them, but Samuel noticed that she didn't correct him, didn't insist on being called Helena. It was a small step, but for him, it meant everything. They continued driving through the darkness, not knowing exactly where they were going, but aware that they were together, and that, for the first time in a long time, they were fighting for the same goal: to reclaim the truth, to reclaim what had been lost. Samuel and Helena drove for hours, traversing back roads winding through hills and woods, until they finally spotted a small wooden cabin hidden among the trees by a stream. Samuel knew this place, a rustic refuge far from any activity, which belonged to an old friend. He knew it would be the perfect place to hide while they decided their next step. He parked the car behind the cabin, hiding it from nearby roads, and helped Helena out. The early morning darkness enveloped everything around them, and the sound of the stream beside the cabin brought a rare moment of peace. Helena was exhausted, her eyes heavy with fatigue and confusion, but she still followed him, trusting Samuel despite the chaos her life had become. They entered the cabin, and Samuel lit a small oil lamp, which cast soft shadows on the wooden walls. The space was modest, with a simple bed in one corner and a small table, but it was warm and safe. And in that moment, that was all that mattered. Helena sat on the bed, hugging herself as if trying to protect herself from the cold that came from both inside and outside. Samuel sat at the table, watching her in silence for a moment before grabbing a bottle of water and offering it to her. She drank slowly, each sip seeming to help her regain some calm. I know all of this is too much for you, Clara, he began, using the name she still wasn't ready to accept. But now we're here, and we have a bit of time before Ortega finds us. We need to decide what to do next. But above all, I need you to trust me. Helena looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of confusion and pain. It was as if she was trapped in a labyrinth of conflicting emotions. She ran her hands through her hair, trying to organize her thoughts before finally speaking. I don't know who I am, Samuel. Her words came out in a whisper full of despair. Sometimes when you talk to me, I feel like you're talking to someone else, but I also feel like that person is inside me, struggling to come out. I just don't know how to reach her. Samuel knelt in front of her, holding her hands in his eyes locked on hers, seeking the connection he felt was still there, even though it was buried under so many layers of confusion. Clara, I know you're still in there. I can feel it. He squeezed her hands gently, trying to convey all the hope he held in his heart. Ortega may have erased your memories, but he didn't erase who you are, who we always were. I promise I'll help you find the truth, no matter the cost. Helena let the tears fall, no longer trying to hide them. She leaned forward, resting her forehead on Samuel's shoulder, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Samuel felt the weight of her despair, but also an opening, a crack in the walls. Ortega had built around her after a few minutes. Helena pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hands, and regained her composure. There was a new firmness in her gaze, a decision beginning to take shape. If what you say is true, if I really am Clara, then I need to find out for myself. I need to see where we lived, where everything began. Maybe that will bring back something I lost. She hesitated, as if she didn't fully believe her own words, but then nodded to herself. Take me there. Samuel, take me to the place where we lived. Samuel felt a surge of hope. It was a dangerous step, but also a path to the truth. Their old home was a few hours away, a simple house in a quiet neighborhood that he had left after Clara's death. He knew that going back there could be risky, but if it helped restore her memories, it would be worth every risk. We'll go at dawn, he replied, a faint smile forming on his face, the first in a long time. I'll take you back home. Helena looked at him, trying to return his smile, but the anxiety in her chest kept her from feeling any real relief. Still, she nodded, feeling that it was a step in the right direction, even if the path ahead was shrouded in shadows. The dawn arrived timidly, coloring the sky with a soft gray as the mist rose from the stream, covering the fields around the cabin. Samuel and Helena were ready, both silent and immersed in their thoughts. Samuel guided Helena to the car, and they set off towards the old house that was once their home. The hours on the road passed slowly, each mile traveled bringing up a series of emotions that Samuel tried to keep in check. Beside him, Helena kept her eyes fixed on the scenery passing by the window, as if trying to capture every detail, hoping that something might awaken her memory. But with each new bend in the road, she only felt an emptiness. Growing inside her, finally, they arrived at a small town nestled among hills and surrounded by woods. Where time seemed to have stopped, Samuel drove through quiet streets to a tree-lined neighborhood where modest houses stood, each with its own small, well-tended garden. He stopped in front of a red brick house with a white wooden fence that he himself had built years ago. Helena looked at the house for a long time, her eyes scanning every detail. There's the blue door, the swing hanging from the garden tree, the bedroom window that overlooked the river that wound behind the house. Something stirred in her chest, but it was still a vague feeling, like a memory that refused to take shape. Samuel got out of the car and walked around to open Helena's door, extending his hand to her. We're here, he said, his voice soft but filled with an emotion he couldn't hide. This is our home, the place where where Clara and I built a life together. Helena got out of the car, keeping her hand in his, and together they walked along the stone path leading to the door. The wood creaked under Samuel's feet As he turned the key in the lock and opened the door for the first time in years, the air inside the house was cold and stale, but the walls still held traces of a life once filled with laughter and plans. The two entered slowly, as if afraid of disturbing the silence that filled the place. Helena stopped at the entrance to the living room, observing the furniture covered with sheets, the photographs framed on the walls, the small marks on the doorframe that recorded the heights of a time she couldn't recall. She walked slowly to one of the photographs, where she saw a smiling couple, Samuel, younger and with a look full of love, beside a woman who could be herself, but who, at that moment, seemed like a stranger. She ran her fingers over the glass of the frame, touching the face of that woman as if expecting, somehow, the gesture to return the lost memories to her. I was happy here, wasn't I? She whispered, not taking her eyes off the photo. But why can't I feel that? Why does everything seem so distant? Samuel approached, standing beside her, and gently touched her shoulder. You were happy here, Clara. Very happy. His voice trembled, laden with the pain of remembering what he had lost. We were happy, and that was taken from us. But I'm here by your side, and if you can remember, I'll be here to help you. She turned her face to him, her eyes brimming with tears, and for a moment Samuel saw something change in her expression. It was as if a barrier had been broken, as if a flash of recognition crossed her gaze. But before she could say anything, a distant sound broke the air. A car. Approaching quickly, Samuel felt a shiver run down his spine and rushed to the window, pulling the curtain just enough to see the road. There, a black SUV came to a sudden stop in front of the house, and he immediately recognized the driver. It's Ortega. He found us. The words escaped his lips like a sigh of despair. He turned to Helena, who looked at him with wide eyes, panic beginning to take over her expression again. What do we do now, Samuel? She asked, her voice almost a whisper, as panic gripped her movements. Samuel looked around, trying to think quickly. The house didn't offer many escape routes, and confronting Ortega directly would be a risk he couldn't take, especially with Helena still so fragile. He knew they needed more time, but Ortega was determined to bring her back. We need to get out of here, through the back door, quickly. He grabbed her hand, leading her through the kitchen, toward the backyard, where there was a small gate that led to the woods. But before they could reach the exit, the front door was thrown open with a bang, and Ortega's voice echoed through the house. Helena, I know you're here, he shouted, his voice filled with uncontrolled rage. Come back to me now, and maybe I'll forgive your madness. Helena froze, her eyes fixed on the open door and on Ortega's figure, which stood outlined in the sunlight. There was a flash of despair in her eyes, a mixture of fear and confusion. Samuel held her hand tighter, trying to bring her back to the present moment. Don't listen to him, Clara. Don't let him take you back, he insisted, trying to keep his voice firm, but the sound of footsteps approaching indicated that Ortega was determined to reach them. Helena looked at Samuel and then at Ortega, as if being pulled in opposite directions, each representing a different life. And at that moment, with a breaking heart, Samuel realized that the final choice could not be his. Helena or Clara would have to decide which truth to follow. The tension in the air was palpable. Ortega's footsteps echoed closer and closer, and Samuel knew they were running out of time. Helena remained at his side, his hand holding hers tightly, like an anchor keeping her in the present, but the confusion on her face was visible, an internal battle. She seemed to be waging against herself. Samuel looked into Helena's eyes, trying to convey all the urgency and love he felt for her. Clara, I know you're in there. I know it's hard, but you have to believe me. You have to believe in us. His voice was a desperate whisper, like a prayer. Don't let Ortega take you. He has no right to decide who you should be. She closed her eyes, pinching the bridge of her nose as if trying to find a hidden strength within herself. But when she opened them again, Ortega's figure was already at the kitchen door, his blue eyes fixed on hers, filled with a cold, possessive fury. Helena, darling, let's end this madness. Ortega opened his arms as if trying to be welcoming, but his voice was filled with authority. "Come back to me. Forget this man. This farce he's trying to create. I am your husband. I am the only person you can trust." Samuel felt the pressure build in his chest. He saw hesitation grow in Helena's eyes, as if part of her was still trapped in the lies Ortega had told for so many years. But he also saw something more, something that shone behind the uncertainty, a spark of fight, of desire for freedom. Ortega took another step toward her, his hand extended. "Come, Helena, come home." For a moment, Helena seemed to waver, her eyes shifting between Samuel and Ortega. But then, as if she found a new strength within herself, she took a step back, pulling away from Ortega's hand. "Don't call me Helena." Her voice was weak at first, but quickly gained strength. "I don't know who I am completely, but I know that you lied to me, you hid my past, made me believe there was nothing before you, and now I can no longer trust you." Ortega's expression hardened, and Samuel saw the desperation turn into something darker. He took another step forward, and Samuel positioned himself in front of Helena like a shield. "You won't take her from me, Samuel," Ortega snarled, his face twisted with anger. "I saved her. I rebuilt her piece by piece when she was lost. You think she'll choose you after everything?" Samuel felt the anger burning inside him, but kept his voice firm. "Clara has the right to choose for herself, and if you really loved her, you'd respect that." He took a deep breath, trying to stay in control. "But I know you won't let that happen, will you, Ortega? That's why, if you really want to keep her, you'll have to go through me." Ortega lunged forward with a sudden movement, and Samuel barely had time to react before feeling the impact of a punch on his face. He staggered but didn't fall, struggling to stay on his feet. Helena screamed, bringing her hands to her face, but Samuel saw that something had changed in her, a spark of determination that was no longer willing to be extinguished. She ran to the table where a small metal statue rested and held it with both hands, her eyes fixed on Ortega. "Stop, Diego!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the house with a force that even surprised herself. "If you touch him again, I swear I won't forgive you. I choose my own path now." Ortega froze, looking at Helena as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. But then he realized that something had changed irrevocably. Helena was no longer the woman he controlled, the one he could convince with sweet words and empty promises. He lowered his arms, his anger turning into something more dangerous, a cold calculation. "This isn't over, Clara," he said, backing away towards the door. "You may have won today, but I always find a way to get what I want." But even as he left the house, Samuel and Helena knew that something had changed. Ortega seemed smaller, as if he had finally realized he no longer had control over them. When he got into the car and drove off, leaving only dust and the sound of the engine fading down the road, Samuel felt the weight of the threat, but also a sense of victory. Helena collapsed into Samuel's arms, the tears finally flowing freely. He held her tightly, feeling his own body tremble with the intensity of the moment. They knew Ortega might try to come back, that there was still danger lurking, but they also knew they had taken a decisive step toward freedom. That night, as the sun set behind the mountains and the house plunged back into quiet, Samuel and Helena, hand in hand, looked towards the horizon. They were ready to leave, to put behind them the fear and pain and build a new future. Together, the days following the confrontation with Ortega were a period of transition. Samuel and Helena finally left the old house and set off towards a new town, a place where the memories of a painful past did not weigh so heavily. They found a small house by a river, where the sound of the running water brought a tranquility they both longed for. Samuel saw Clara, now definitely Clara, without doubts or hesitation, finding her way to a new life. She still carried the traumas of her amnesia, the nightmares that sometimes woke her in the middle of the night, but she was learning to cope with them, to face her scars with the same strength she had always had. and Samuel stood by her side at every step, rediscovering the joy of seeing her bloom once again. They resumed the little things they had lost: quiet walks by the river, afternoons reading under the shade of a tree, conversations that stretched late into the night, and, little by little, the echoes of Clara's previous life as Helena faded away, as she reconnected with the essence of who she truly was. However, the threat of Ortega never completely disappeared. He was still a shadow hovering over their memories, a ghost they knew they needed to remain vigilant against. But the last letter they received from one of Samuel's friends brought news that eased their worries. Ortega had been caught up in a corruption scandal that consumed his fortune and reputation, and he now lived in seclusion, far from any power he might wield against them. When they heard this, Clara and Samuel felt a weight finally lift from their shoulders. It was as if, for the first time, they could breathe freely, without fear of what might come next. One cold autumn morning, Clara and Samuel sat by the river's edge, watching the sunrise, the golden colors reflected in the water, creating a landscape that seemed like a painting in constant change. Clara rested her head on Samuel's shoulder, holding his hand, and he felt her warmth blend with his own, a quiet comfort that held more meaning than any words. "You know, Samuel," she murmured, her voice as gentle as the sound of the water, "if someone had told me that I would go through all of this and still find peace, I wouldn't have believed them, but here I am. Here we are." He smiled, a small, sincere smile, and squeezed her hand. "And I would have waited for you, my whole life, if that's what it took," he replied, emotion clear in his voice. "Because in the end, I always knew I'd find you again, Clara, even when everything seemed lost." Clara turned to him, her eyes shining with tears. But this time, they were tears of gratitude, of a love that hadn't been destroyed, only transformed. She leaned forward, sealing those words with a gentle kiss, while the sun rose on the horizon, illuminating the new path they were ready to walk. And at that moment, Samuel and Clara knew that despite the scars and the pain, they had found a new beginning. The love that bound them was no longer the same as before. It was stronger, forged in the fire of hardships. Through the resilience of a journey that had seemed impossible, they stood up, still hand in hand, and walked toward the future, aware that the road wouldn't be easy, but confident that together they could face anything.